I was born with a cursed mouth, and I was the unluckiest baseborn daughter of Northcott Hall. When I was 7, my older half-sister stole my only winter coat, and I cried that all 10 of her fingers would rot with frost. The next day she fell through the lake ice, and every one of those 10 fingers festered. When I was 13, my stepmother locked me in the woodshed with no food or water. I muttered that she'd see blood before sunset, and half an hour later a panicked stallion broke her ribs. After that, everyone in Northcott Hall called me a calamity. My father said I poisoned the house just by standing in it. My stepmother accused me of killing my grandmother and dumped me in a pauper's burial field. I lived on bark and roots, and all I wanted was to carry my mother's ashes home to the Veyra Highlands. I'd barely reached the city gate when Beatrice arrived with crown guards and blocked my path. The Dowager Queen has ordered a noblewoman chosen to be buried with the Emperor. If Northcott Hall gives up a daughter, the whole family is honored. You're an embarrassment alive. At least your death can bring this house some glory. My father took the payment with his own hands and ordered the servants to nail me into the coffin. What they didn't know was that the Emperor wasn't dead at all. A few days earlier, at a palace banquet, I'd seen him standing in the winter wind and said, dressed that lightly, His Majesty may stop breathing from the cold tonight. Before dawn, the palace announced the Emperor had no pulse. I kicked the coffin lid open, looked around at a burial chamber full of royal treasure, and smiled. Your Majesty, I've come to lift your curse. When I kicked open the coffin lid, the mausoleum steward tumbled down the steps in terror. White mourning banners twisted in the wind, and mourning papers scattered across the chamber. Someone screamed, the dead woman's moving. Half my body was still trapped inside the coffin, and an iron shackle around my ankle had been bolted to the bottom. Northcott Hall had been determined to make certain I died. Even their burial sacrifice came with a lock. Fresh scratches marked the inside wall of the coffin. Beatrice had carved them. Calamities belong underground, rotting forever. I laughed once. The coffin nails had already torn my palm open. The mausoleum steward had nearly lost his senses. Hold her down. Don't let that filthy thing near His Majesty. 2 young attendants rushed me, but I caught the coffin edge and dragged myself free. In the central sarcophagus, Emperor Cassian Thornfield's face had turned gray, yet his chest still moved faintly. An elderly palace steward hurried over and planted his boot on the back of my hand. A sacrificial girl sent by Northcott Hall dares touch the Emperor? My fingernails bent backward beneath his heel, and pain darkened my vision. He spat beside me. With a fate like yours, even your corpse pollutes the royal tomb. I looked up and smiled coldly. If your eyes are useless, have them cut out. Delay any longer and blood will start leaking from every opening in his face. The instant I finished speaking, 2 trails of black blood appeared beneath Cassian's nose. A junior attendant dropped to his knees. Steward Bram, His Majesty's bleeding. Bram's expression changed. He pointed at me and started shouting. Calamity. Her curse has woken up. Beat her to death. Now. The other women chosen for the burial huddled in a corner and sobbed. Don't drag us into this. She's Northcott Hall's cursed daughter. Kill her. Guards forced me to the floor, and my forehead struck the stone tiles. Northcott's cast off. Even dead, she'd stain the mausoleum. I bit through my lip but refused to shed a tear. All through childhood, tears at Northcott Hall had earned only harder blows. My mother's ashes were still in that house. If I died here, even her remains would have nowhere to rest. I raised my voice and screamed, the incense burner is poisoned. I jerked my chin toward the bronze vessel in the center of the chamber. Let it burn another few minutes and every living person in this room goes down. Bram was about to order someone to gag me when a young attendant suddenly clutched his throat and fell, his face turning purple. Every insult in the room stopped. Bram stepped backward, and I used the confusion to crawl to the burner and scrape aside the ash. A layer of Veyra datura powder had been hidden beneath it. The room had smelled exactly like this when my mother died. My father had stood outside her door then, unwilling even to touch her forehead because he thought she was unlucky. I pulled a silver burial pin from my hair and cut Cassian's fingertip. Blackened blood welled from the wound at once. Bring cold water, coarse salt, and clean needles. Hurry. Everyone stared without moving. Or bring nothing. When the Emperor really dies, every one of you can follow him down for real. That threat worked better than anything else. A basin arrived quickly, followed by needles. I drew off more than half a bowl of poisoned blood before a trace of living color returned to Cassian's face. His eyes opened slowly. Who sent you? Before I could answer, a shrill proclamation sounded beyond Hollowcrest Mausoleum. By order of the Dowager Queen, His Majesty has entered final rest. Seal the coffins and begin burial at once. No one may reopen or inspect them. I drew breath to shout. Cassian's hand closed suddenly around my wrist from inside the sarcophagus. Keep playing dead. I want to see who's most desperate to bury me. I lowered my eyes. Blood still ran from the iron wound around my ankle. Northcott Hall wanted me dead. The Dowager Queen wanted him dead. Whether I saved the Emperor or not, no one meant to let me survive the night. Cassian saw that I hadn't moved and warned me again. Quick. Get back in the sacrifice coffin. I nearly cursed him aloud and wished him a miserable death. Before I could, he pressed half of a crest-marked medallion into my palm. Survive tonight. Whatever Northcott Hall owes you in blood, I'll collect it for you myself. He coughed, and black blood stained the corner of his mouth. Whatever they owe you, I'll collect. I'd heard too many beautiful promises inside that family. My father always said he'd buy me new clothes once my stepmother calmed down. Moira always promised that if I admitted fault, she'd let me out of the shed and feed me. Beatrice had sworn more than once that sisters could never truly harm each other. But trusting Cassian was the only path out alive. Your Majesty had better keep his word. The moment I lay back inside the coffin, someone outside started pouring powdered lime through the gaps. I didn't dare cough. I covered my mouth and nose with both hands. Tears, blood, and bitter lime ran together down my throat. Chaotic footsteps filled the outer passage. The Dowager Queen's agents had entered the mausoleum. The officer leading them went straight to the central sarcophagus, saw that the lid hadn't been nailed shut, and turned toward mine. Inspect the sacrifice first. Through the wood, I heard the men talking. Lord Northcott took 3,000 silver crowns from the Dowager Queen. He sold this cursed daughter without blinking. Lady Northcott slipped us an extra purse too, with instructions. If the wretch isn't fully dead, finish her before she can crawl home and spoil Lady Beatrice's luck. My whole body started shaking beyond my control. 3,000 crowns. That was the price my father took to nail me into a coffin. Hands that greedy should rot before they hold another coin. The instant I spoke, a scream erupted outside. My hand. What's happening to my hand? The officer stopped lifting the burial cloth. Dark blisters spread across the back of his hand and started breaking open. Everyone retreated in panic. The dead woman's spite is on us. Cassian used the moment to cough a mouthful of black blood inside the neighboring sarcophagus. He sounded like something crawling up out of a grave to take a life with it. The Dowager Queen's guard stepped back. The officer clutched his hand and forced out an order. Seal the mausoleum. Her Majesty commands that the living and the dead stay inside. The hammering carried me back to the steps of Northcott Hall, where Beatrice had bent toward my coffin and smiled. Don't be afraid, Elara. It's dark in there, I know, but that's better than having you where I can see you. My arms and legs were going numb. I couldn't let myself be trapped and smothered again. I searched the coffin floor and found a short ceremonial knife among the burial goods. I cut through the ropes binding my wrists and ankles. Cassian didn't move. He pressed a raised stone set into the base of his sarcophagus. A thunderous grinding came from the deepest burial passage, and dust fell from the ceiling. The vaults are collapsing. Run. The guards forgot the burial order and fled for their lives. Hollowcrest Mausoleum fell silent again. I dragged in breath after breath and believed we'd escaped. Cassian sat up in the central coffin and wiped the blood from his lips. Tomorrow morning, the Dowager Queen will announce my death before the Crown Council. Every guard in Stone Harbor will be ordered to search for our bodies. Cold sweat covered my back. What happens if Northcott Hall catches me first? Cassian looked at me. I'll save you. Cassian's personal guard, Tobias Vance, hid me inside a side chamber of Hollowcrest Mausoleum. Only after I'd stripped off the burial dress did I realize the cloth bundle I always carried was gone. It held the urn with my mother's ashes. I grabbed Tobias by the sleeve. Where are my mother's remains? He looked startled. You weren't carrying an urn when they brought you in. Northcott Hall must have kept it to keep a grip on me. I'd found a way out of the grave only to feel it close again. Every humiliation, every swallowed grief, lodged in my throat. I'd walk straight back into death before I left my mother in that house. Tobias blocked the doorway. Lady Elara, don't do anything reckless. I shoved him aside. Move. Before my mother died, she held my hand and made me promise to take her home to Veyra. Everything I've survived was for the chance to keep that promise. Conflict crossed his face. The city's crawling with the Dowager Queen's informants. Cassian coughed behind the curtain and came out, one hand braced against the doorframe. Tobias dropped to one knee. Your Majesty. Cassian didn't stop me. He handed me a bronze authority token. The charity morgue outside the eastern gate. Go. Then he added, Northcott Hall will be there to identify a body and collect the reward. I turned toward the exit. Cassian lifted one hand. Take 2 guards. Come back alive. A Northcott carriage stood outside the morgue. From behind a curtain, I heard Moira Northcott sobbing with extraordinary force. My poor Elara. She was baseborn, but I raised that girl with these 2 hands. Beatrice covered the corner of her mouth with an embroidered handkerchief. Don't grieve, mother. Elara's luck was cruel, but dying for the crown is an honor. Through the gap in the curtain I saw a woman's body under a white cloth. My father, Cedric Northcott, stood nearby wearing an expression of deep sorrow while his eyes kept sliding toward the reward ledger in a palace official's hands. Moira covered her nose and dropped her voice. The smell is unbearable. If I'd known, I'd have starved her a few days before we sent her off, so there'd be less filth in her. Cedric warned her quietly. Keep your voice down. Don't let the palace men hear you. Beatrice put out one polished shoe and kicked the covered corpse. She was a disaster alive, but at least she picked a useful time to die. Once the Dowager Queen pays out, I'll have a reason to enter the palace mourning rites. Anger burned through me. Cry that falsely and your painted face will split open. Moira screamed. Powder peeled off her cheeks, showing the raw, scratched rash underneath. Cedric recoiled and pointed at the corpse. The body's cursed. Get a priest. Bring salt and holy water. Moira scrambled behind him and pulled my mother's urn out of her sleeve. She held it over the burning brazier. Veyra Northcott, I know your spirit's here. Show yourself, or there won't be a grain of your foreign mother left. Reason snapped. I threw the curtain aside and ran into the yard. Give me my mother. All three of them went white when they saw me alive. To cover her fear, Moira pitched her voice loud enough for the crowd. You cursed creature. You're still alive? You killed grandmother Adeline years ago, and now you've come back to destroy the rest of us. I looked at her and laughed coldly. Did I really kill Adeline? She was poisoned for months with cinnabar stirred into her sleeping draught. The morgue examiner was standing right there. At those words he stepped over to the older set of bones laid out on the ground. After a long inspection, his expression changed. These bones are darkened, and the residue in the joints matches long-term cinnabar poisoning. My father's first instinct wasn't to investigate his own mother's murder. His eyes went red as he waved the household guards forward. Shut that cursed girl's mouth before she spreads another lie. Northcott Hall didn't dare bring the city watch into it. My father swore I'd been staging tricks and had the household guards drag me home. They forced me to kneel outside the family shrine, the spot reserved for every beating and punishment of my childhood. Beatrice set my mother's urn beside a brazier. Admit you're a calamity, and admit you went to the royal tomb willingly. Then I might be generous enough to give this ugly jar back. She sent a maid to fetch the last winter coat my mother had sewn before she died. Remember this, Veyra? You were 7, and you cursed me over this rag. It should have been burned years ago, but you guarded it like treasure. Moira gave the housekeeper, Winifred Doyle, a look. Hold her down. Make her bow to Lady Beatrice. Winifred pressed a hand to the back of my neck. Bow to your sister and thank her for keeping Northcott Hall's dignity. As my face neared the floor, I locked both arms and held. My father shouted, why haven't you admitted your fault yet? I lifted my head. Blood ran from the corner of my mouth. What did I do wrong? Moira slammed the table and stood. Your mistake was being born worthless and refusing to stay obedient. Beatrice bent down and tossed the coat beside the brazier. Confess, and you get your mother's ashes. Sparks landed on the old fabric. I looked toward the memorial plaques on the shrine wall. Then let every Northcott ancestor hear it. This whole house is rotten enough to hold a dead woman's ashes over a fire to break the living. Dust came down from the shrine beam. One of the plaques crashed beside my father's boot, and he stumbled back in terror. Moira threw herself at him and started crying. Look at that, Cedric. The calamity came back to kill us all. Tie her up and hand her to the Dowager Queen for another reward. Beatrice knelt in front of my father. Yes, father. As the recognized daughter of Northcott Hall, I'm willing to enter the palace and lead the mourning rites for His Majesty. If I can get close to the Dowager Queen and the young prince she means to put on the throne, I can save this family. So that was her plan. She meant to climb into the palace by stepping over my coffin. To humiliate me, Beatrice changed into her mourning clothes while making me kneel out in the freezing corridor. Do you understand now, Veyra? You only ever get into a coffin like a rat, while I walk through the palace gates in front of the whole court. I watched her roll the sealing clay she'd pried off my mother's urn between her fingers. Right in front of me, she ground it to powder under her shoe. I lunged for what was left of my mother. My father crossed the room and slapped me across the face. Why can't you show one fraction of your sister's sense? He didn't look at me again. He turned to lift Beatrice's long mourning train so it wouldn't touch the dust. I lay on the floor and laughed under my breath. If she touches the Emperor's coffin tonight, she'll be on her knees begging me to save her by morning. A palace attendant beside her whispered, Lady Beatrice, the Dowager Queen says that if you keep all 3 nights of vigil, Northcott Hall will be shown extraordinary favor once the young prince takes the crown. Beatrice set her incense in the burner and rested a hand on the coffin lid. He's really dead, isn't he? Cashin's voice came from inside the coffin. Beatrice. Were you certain I was dead before you came to collect your reward? The grand morning hall of the imperial sanctum was draped in 30,000 yards of bleached silk, the air thick with burning white sandalwood, myrrh, and the bitter copper stench of melted tallow. Beatrice stood before the gold-chased cedar casket, her silk mourning robes pinned with pearls stolen from my mother's old jewel box. Her cheeks were rouged. Beneath a delicate dusting of rice powder, her hands folded in an attitude of pious, theatrical devotion. She had practiced her grief in the mirror for 3 hours before leaving Northcott Hall, aiming to look like an innocent maiden. Shattered by royal tragedy, an ornament fit for the Dowager Queen to place in the lap of the boy prince next in line. When the voice spoke from within the cedar casket, Beatrice's smile did not vanish immediately, it simply curdled, locking her features in a hideous, frozen grimace. Who? Beatrice's throat clicked dryly. She took half a step back, her train catching on the bronze foot of a candelabra. Who made that noise? The 4 grand acolytes surrounding the bier remained kneeling, their silver censers swinging in rigid, panicked arcs. None of them dared breathe. You asked if I was truly dead, Lady Beatrice, the voice murmured again, smooth as polished obsidian, dragging with it the rasp of dried blood. You seemed remarkably anxious for the confirmation. A heavy, deliberate thud sounded against the lid. The heavy gilded nails that had been tapped into the rim, set loose by Tobias Vance's tools 2 hours before twilight, shivered. Then, with a scream of tearing wood, the entire top slab of the imperial casket rose 6 inches, tilted on its iron pivots, and crashed downward onto the marble dais. The sound tore through the cathedral vault like a cannon shot. Beatrice shrieked, stumbling backward into the skirts of the dowager queens. Senior ladies in waiting. 2 courtiers scrambled across the floor on their hands and knees, scattering tallow and pearl prayer beads. Cassian Thornfield sat upright among the white velvet cushions. He still wore the shroud tunic of an emperor laid in state, black velvet, bordered with beaten silver wire, but the grey pallor of the Veyra datura had receded from his cheekbones. His eyes, cold and slate-grey under the torchlight, fixed upon Beatrice's trembling form. 2 dark streaks of dried blood marked the skin below his nostrils, the poison I had drawn from his veins with coarse salt and needles in the dark of Hollowcrest. Your Majesty. The chief minister collapsed flat onto his stomach, his forehead striking the stone so hard the sound echoed off the high rafters. A miracle. By the grace of the sun, His Majesty has returned from the shadow. It is no miracle, Lord Minister, Cassian said softly, stepping cleanly out of the box that had been designed to become his tomb. He did not sway. The poison had weakened him, but the fury in his spine held him straighter than a drawn broadsword. It was merely an inefficient assassination. And a remarkably hasty burial. His gaze slid past the weeping courtiers and locked onto the high terrace where Dowager Queen Aurelia sat in her gilded chair of state. Aurelia did not scream. Her knuckles turned dead white against the carved lion heads of her armrests, and the heavy emerald collar at her throat hitched as she swallowed. Her face was an iron mask, though her chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow spasms. Cassian, Aurelia managed, her voice trembling before she caught it, forcing it into a register of hollow maternal warmth. You breathe. The court physicians swore your heart had ceased 3 nights ago. Did they? Cassian smiled, a thin, razor-edge curve of his lips that brought no warmth to his eyes. Then we shall have to examine the physician's eyes. And their ledgers. Down below the dais, Beatrice was still crawling backward on her knees, her elaborate lace sleeves trailing in pools of melted wax. She looked at Cassian as if he were an executioner rising from the lake of fire. I only came to pray, Beatrice babbled, her voice climbing into a shrill, hysterical pitch. Your Majesty, I knew nothing. Northcott Hall is loyal. My father sent me to honor the crown. We gave our cursed sister to the tomb to seal the misfortune. You gave your sister to the tomb, Cassian interrupted, descending the marble steps with measured, predatory steps, because your father sold her for 3,000 silver crowns. And you, Lady Beatrice, came here hoping to trade her corpse for an imperial marriage. He stopped 2 paces from where she knelt. The shadow of his tall frame swallowed her whole. Where is she? Cassian asked. Beatrice's jaw worked soundlessly. She is at the hall. In the courtyard. Father was purifying the house of her taint. Cassian did not look back at the Dowager Queen, nor at the 100 guards who stood frozen at the hall's perimeter, unsure whether to draw steel for their resurrected sovereign or the terrified regent on the high chair. Tobias, Cassian commanded without raising his voice. From the shadows behind the high pillars, Captain Tobias Vance stepped forward. 80 armored men of the Imperial vanguard falling into formation behind him, their drawn blades gleaming like winter water. Take 200 men, Cassian said, his eyes never leaving Beatrice's white face. Ride to Northcott Hall. If a single hair on Alara's head has been burned, bring me Cedric Northcott's head in an unwashed sack. He paused, glancing down at Beatrice. And take this one with you. Tie her to the back of the saddle. Let her show you the way home. The freezing mud of the Northcott courtyard had seeped through the thin linen of my inner shift, turning my knees to numb, wooden pegs. My father's second strike had torn the skin over my cheekbone. The blood had run down into my collar and dried there, stiffening the cloth against my neck. Above me, the ancestral shrine of Northcott Hall loomed like a black mouth in the midnight rain. Burn it, Moira hissed from beneath the shelter of the covered gallery. She was clutching an embroidered shawl around her neck, her cheeks still spotted with raw red welts from the curse I had flung at her outside the morgue. Burn the foreign witch's ashes right in front of her. Let her see where her defiance ends. Winifred Doyle, the old housekeeper whose knuckles were swollen from 30 years of striking servant girls, held the porcelain urn directly over the iron brazier. The coals below were orange-white, spitting angry sparks as the rain drifted beneath the eaves. The sealing wax around the lid had already melted into a foul-smelling grease that dribbled into the fire. I'll ask you one last time, baseborn wretch, my father, Cedric, barked. He stood beside the brazier with a heavy leather quirt dangling from his wrist. Sign the confession. Swear in your own blood that you stole the family silver and poisoned your grandmother out of malice, and that you climbed into the imperial tomb of your own accord to escape justice. I looked up through the strands of matted hair plastered to my forehead. The pain in my ankle, where the iron shackle from Hollowcrest had chewed through flesh to the bone, was a dull, rhythmic throb. But beneath the pain, a strange, burning heat was rising in my chest. It was the same heat that had flared when I was 7 on the frozen lake, the same heat that had broken Moira's ribs under the stallion's hooves. My mother had told me once, when she was still strong enough to comb my hair with her wooden comb, Alara, our people in the Veyra Mountains do not sing to entertain. We sing to bind the world to the truth. When the world lies, the song must cut. I will sign nothing, Cedric, I whispered. Speak up, he roared, stepping forward and raising the quirt. You have no voice here. You are a dog born of a mountain whore. I said. I raised my head, staring directly into his watery, bloodshot eyes. That those hands of yours have taken blood money for the last time. Every coin you took from the Dowager Queen will burn through your flesh before sunrise. Cedric's face darkened with rage. You vile, ungrateful creature. Burn the jar. Winifred. Tip the ash into the dung heap. Winifred inverted her wrists. Before the jar could tilt, the outer gates of Northcott Hall exploded inward with a sound like splitting thunder. The heavy oak beams, reinforced with iron straps, shattered into splinters under the impact of an iron-shod battering ram. The scream of tearing hinges was followed instantly by the thunder of 80 heavy cavalry plunging through the archway, their black cloaks billowing in the rain like the wings of predatory birds. Winifred shrieked, dropping the urn. I lunged forward on my torn knees, sliding through the freezing mud, ignoring the agony in my ankle, and caught the round ceramic base against my ribs an inch before it struck the flagstones. The hot clay scalded my skin through the wet linen, but I curled my body around it, burying my face into the cold neck of the jar. Mother, I breathed into the clay. I have you. Treason. Cedric shouted, stumbling back toward the gallery steps, drawing his short-dress sword with a shaking hand. Bandits in the city. Guards, defend the courtyard. None of the household guards moved. They had seen the silver-crested mantles of the riders. Tobias Vance swung down from his gray stallion before the beast had even come to a full halt. In his left hand, he held a leather lead line tied to the other. And, dragged through 5 miles of city mire, was Beatrice. Her morning silks were shredded, soaked with filth, her face blackened with soot and horse dung, her fingers raw and bleeding where she had tried to keep herself from being pulled under the hooves. She collapsed onto the flagstones at her mother's feet like a sack of wet salt. Beatrice. Moira screamed, rushing forward, only to be shoved back by the butt of a vanguard spear. What is the meaning of this? Lord Cedric is a peer of the realm. Who dares violate Northcott Hall? Tobias did not look at her. He walked through the rain, his iron boots ringing on the stone, until he stood before where I knelt in the mud, cradling the urn. He removed his heavy wool cloak, lined with wolf fur, and draped it gently around my shivering shoulders. Lady Alara, Tobias said, his rough voice dropping low with absolute deference. His Imperial Majesty has returned to the throne. He has sent us to escort you to the palace. He paused, then turned his gaze toward Cedric Northcott, who had gone the color of sour cream. And His Majesty has commanded that no one in this house shall leave until the debt is paid. The great hall of Northcott Hall was lit with 4 dozen torches, their smoky orange glare illuminating the grand tapestries that Cedric's ancestors had bought with Veyran plunder 2 centuries ago. Cashin arrived before the rain stopped. He did not ride in a carriage. He rode a black destrier, wearing a high-collared coat of imperial slate gray, his broadsword belted at his hip. When he stepped over the threshold of Northcott Hall, the 4 dozen household servants fell to their knees in a wave of gasps and frantic prayers, pressing their faces to the cold timber floor. Cedric was kneeling before the hearth, his hands bound behind his back with hemp rope. Moira knelt beside him, her hair wild, her nails digging into her palms. until blood dripped onto her silk skirt. I sat in the high-backed master's chair near the hearth, the chair where my father had sat for 20 years while he denied me food, coats, and medicine. Tobias had cleaned the blood from my face and wrapped my torn ankle in clean linen and bitter salve. The wolf fur cloak was warm around my shoulders, and my mother's urn rested safely in my lap, cool and whole. Cassian walked straight to me. He did not look at Cedric, nor at Moira, nor at Beatrice, who lay weeping in the corner like a broken doll. He stopped in front of my chair, reached out with one gloved hand, and gently brushed a wet strand of hair away from the cut on my cheekbone. His touch was surprisingly warm against my frozen skin. "Did they break anything?" he asked. "No," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. "Only their own luck." Cassian gave a short, grim nod. He turned slowly on his heel to face Cedric. "Lord Northcott," Cassian said. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop 10 degrees with those two words. "3 days ago, you received an imperial writ, bearing the Dowager Queen's seal, demanding a maiden of Northcott blood to be interred in Hollowcrest to guide my spirit." Cedric began to weep, tears washing clean streaks through the grime on his face. "Your Majesty," I was commanded. "A subject cannot refuse the Dowager Queen." I thought. I truly believed your Majesty had passed into the heavens. If I had known. "You took 3,000 silver crowns," Cassian said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "The ledger from the Imperial Treasury was recovered an hour ago from your private study. You did not give a maiden of your house out of loyalty. You sold a baseborn daughter whom you despised, and you took an additional bribe from the Dowager's private purse to ensure she was shackled inside the wood. It was Moira." Cedric suddenly screamed, twisting his body to point his chin at his wife. "It was her idea. She hated the girl's mother. She told me the Veyran woman was a demon who poisoned the household's fortune. She told me to put Alara in the box." "Cedric, you coward." Moira shrieked, lunging at him with her teeth bared, only for a guard's boot to plant itself firmly against her shoulder, pinning her to the floorboards. "You spent those crowns before the ink was dry. You paid your gambling debts to the House of the Red Boar. You bought your whores and your wine while your own mother lay rotting in the ground." "Enough," I said. The single word cut through their screaming like a cleaver through suet. I stood up, holding the urn against my side, and walked toward the center of the hall. Every step sent a jolt of fire through my ankle, but I did not limp. I refused to limp before them. "You mentioned grandmother Adeline," I said, looking down at Moira. "For 7 years, you told the household that I killed her. You told the servants that I looked at her porridge one morning and muttered that her limbs would turn to stone, and 3 days later she lost the use of her legs." Moira glared at me through her tangled hair, venom spitting from her lips. "You did. You are a calamity. Everything you speak rots." I spoke the truth because I smelled the cinnabar in her tea, I said quietly. "My mother came from the Veyra Highlands. Our healers know the red powder well. It sweetens the breath while it eats the joints and turns the kidneys to gray sludge. Grandmother Adeline would not sign over her dowry lands in the western valleys to your brothers, Moira. So you fed her red dust for 6 months." Cassian raised an eyebrow, glancing at Tobias. "Bring the coroner's report from the eastern morgue," Cassian commanded. Tobias stepped forward, unrolling a stamped parchment. "The exhumation of Lady Adeline Northcott was completed 2 hours ago under the supervision of the Grand Inquisitor. The bone marrow of both femurs and the cervical vertebrae showed heavy crystalline deposits of mercuric sulfide. Lethal concentration." Cedric's jaw dropped. He looked at his wife with genuine, horrified realization. You told me she had the shaking palsy. She was an old hag who lived too long." Moira screamed, her composure shattering completely. She looked down on me because my grandfather was a merchant. She favored that mountain savage Cedric dragged home from the wars. She was going to give the western valleys to Alara's mother. "And what did you do to my mother?" I asked. The hall went dead silent. Even the rain outside seemed to quiet, pattering softly against the leaded glass windows. Moira stopped screaming. A strange, twisted smile spread across her red-welted lips. "Your mother," Moira whispered, her eyes gleaming with malice. "That Highland bitch thought she was so pure with her songs and her mountain herbs. She thought Cedric loved her. She didn't know that Cedric traded her sacred clan pendant to pay his first commission in the Crown Guards. When she took sick with the lung rot, I didn't use cinnabar, Alara. I simply swapped her mountain balm for chalk and dry hemlock. I watched her drown in her own blood for 3 weeks, and she never once cursed me. She only sang to you. Moira laughed, a wet, rattling sound. She died like a dog in the laundry shed. And that is all your precious Highland blood is worth. The heat in my chest didn't flare this time. It turned into a frozen, blinding clarity. I looked at Moira's hands, the hands that had held the hemlock, the hands that had beaten me with broom handles, the hands that had pried the seal off my mother's urn. You have lived by poison, Moira, I said, every word dropping from my mouth like a block of carved granite. And by poison you will leave this world. You will not taste clean water again. Every cup you lift will turn to gall in your throat, and your flesh will remember every drop of hemlock you ever poured. A sharp gasp tore from Moira's throat. She clutched her neck with both hands. Her skin, already inflamed, turned a mottled, bruised purple from her collarbones to her jawline. She opened her mouth to curse me, but only a dry, wheezing hiss escaped her lips, as if her tongue had swollen into a lump of dry salt. Cedric scrambled away from her on his knees, his eyes wild with terror. Demon. She is a demon. Cashin, your majesty, kill her. She will destroy the empire. With her mouth. Cashin walked slowly toward Cedric, drawing his ceremonial dagger from its sheath. He knelt down until his eyes were level with my father's. She did not destroy my empire, Cedric, Cashin said softly. Her words woke me from a grave your conspirators dug for me. It seems her mouth only curses those who are already rotten to the core. He reached out and took Cedric's right hand in his own iron grip. 3,000 crowns from the Dowager Queen. Let us see if her prophecy holds true. Cashin drew the flat of the silver dagger across Cedric's palm, not deep enough to sever a tendon, but enough to draw a thin bead of crimson. The moment the blood touched the air, Cedric screamed. The skin of his palm blistered instantly, turning black and peeling back from the meat beneath, as if the silver blade had been heated in a blacksmith's forge. The rot spread along his fingers, the nails turning brittle and dark, before dropping onto the floorboards with soft, sickening taps. My hand. Cedric shrieked, thrashing on the floor. My hand is on fire. Cut it off. Cut it off. No, Cashin said, standing up and wiping his dagger on Cedric's sleeve. That would be a waste of good steel. Tobias, chain the 3 of them in the cellar where Ilara was kept. Let them have the water from the floor and the bread from the mice. Tomorrow, the Crown Council convenes at dawn. Cashin turned back to me, his hand extended. Come, Ilara. We have an empire to take back. Dawn broke over the capital city of Stone Harbor, not with golden sunlight, but with a sky the color of bruised iron. The Grand Council chamber in the High Citadel was packed with 400 lords, magistrates, and prelates of the realm. At the center of the hall, upon the dais beneath the 9-pointed sun crown, sat the 9-year-old prince. Lucian, the Dowager Queen Aurelia's grandnephew. The boy was dwarfed by the heavy ermine mantle draped over his small shoulders, his eyes darting fearfully between the towering bronze doors and the severe face of the woman standing behind his throne. Aurelia wore the black and gold robes of imperial regency, her high lace ruff framing a face that had not slept a single minute of the night. Lords of the realm, Aurelia's voice rang through the vaulted hall, clear, majestic, and entirely devoid of fear. The sudden passing of our beloved Emperor Cashin has left the throne vacant at an hour of supreme peril. The barbarians of the Veyra Highlands gather on our northern frontier, the treasury is strained, the people weep in the streets. We cannot allow the crown to remain empty. By the ancient right of the Regency Council, I present to you Prince Lucian of House Thornfield. Let the prelates anoint him. The high prelate, an ancient man with a beard reaching his waist and eyes clouded with cataracts, stepped forward with the golden ampulla of holy oil. Does any lord among you, the prelate intoned, his voice shaking with age, speak against the crowning of this child? The chamber was dead silent. The lords knew Cashin had been seen alive at the grand vigil the previous night. Whispers had ripped through the city like wildfire. But Aurelia's private guard, the iron phalanx, stood 4 ranks deep along every wall, their halberds leveled at the benches. To speak was to have one's throat slit before one could reach the door. None speaks, Aurelia said, a cold triumphant smile touching the corners of her mouth. Anoint the boy. I speak, a voice called from the back of the chamber. The great bronze doors did not burst open this time. They swung inward slowly, smoothly, revealing the broad central aisle. Cashin walked in first, wearing full imperial plate armor of black steel inlaid with gold dragons. His broadsword was drawn, resting loosely against his right thigh. Beside him walked a woman who looked nothing like the broken sacrifice Northcott Hall had nailed into a pine box. I wore a tunic of dark Highland wool over trousers of supple deer hide, my hair braided back in the 9-strand pattern of the Veyran mountain chiefs, secured with silver pins that had belonged to my mother. At my hip hung the carved cedar box containing her ashes. Around my neck hung the full imperial crest medallion, the other half of which Cassian had pressed into my bleeding palm in the dark of hollow crest. The 400 lords gasped as one. Several older magistrates dropped to their knees immediately, knocking their heads against the wooden desks. Cassian, Aurelia hissed, stepping in front of the young prince. Her iron phalanx leveled their halberds toward the aisle, their iron boots stomping in unison. You dare bring arms into the sacred council? You were declared dead by the College of Physicians. You are an impostor, a shade conjured by Highland sorcery to steal the boy's birthright. An impostor? Cassian stopped 30 paces from the dais. His voice was not loud, but it possessed the deep, resonant authority of a man who had led armies through 10 winters of war. Aurelia, your poisoners were sloppy. They used Veran datura, a rare herb, expensive and difficult to hide. But they forgot that datura does not kill if the blood is drawn before the third dawn. He pointed his broadsword at the Dowager Queen. And they forgot that the only person in this city who knew how to draw the venom was the very girl you ordered buried alive beside me. Aurelia's eyes flicked to me, burning with aristocratic hatred. A bastard girl. From a disgraced house. A baseborn witch whose father sold her for a handful of silver. You would place the word of a street beggar against the Dowager Queen of the realm? Her father sold her, Cassian said coldly, because you paid him to ensure she never spoke again. You knew she had the sight. You knew she saw your cupbearer slip the powder into my wine at the solstice banquet. Aurelia laughed, a sharp, ringing sound that echoed off the high stone vaults. Words. Empty words from a dying emperor and his mountain harlot. Captain of the phalanx. Clear the hall. Slay the treasonous pretender where he stands. The 60 men of the iron phalanx did not charge. Their captain, a scarred veteran named Kalan who had fought alongside Cassian at the siege of the Red Gate, looked at the emperor's drawn blade, then at the Dowager Queen. Captain. Aurelia shrieked. I hold the imperial seal. Obey me. The seal in your hand, I said, stepping forward beside Cassian, is carved from soft soapstone. The real seal was never in your bedchamber, Aurelia. It was buried in the sarcophagus of the founder, where you were too cowardly to reach. I looked at the captain of the phalanx. Captain Kalan, if you advance one step against your true sovereign, the iron in your breastplate will twist inward and pierce your lung before you can draw breath. Kalan froze. He looked at my eyes, at the dark, unyielding certainty of the Highland bloodline, and then he looked at Cassian. With a sharp, resounding crash, Captain Kalan drove his halberd butt into the stone floor and dropped to his right knee. Hail Cassian, the captain roared. Emperor of the realm. Behind him, all 60 men of the iron phalanx slammed their weapons down and dropped to their knees like falling wheat. Aurelia staggered backward, her hip striking the arm of the throne. The boy Prince Lucian burst into terrified tears, slipping out from beneath the heavy ermine mantle and fleeing down the side steps toward the sanctuary of the scribes. Aurelia was left alone on the high dais, clutching her emerald collar, her face twisted in absolute ruin. You think you have won? Aurelia snarled, her voice dropping into a venomous whisper. You think you can rule this empire with a cursed mountain savage at your side? The lords will never accept her. The great houses will rise. They will drown Stone Harbor in blood before they bow to a witch from Veyra. The great houses will do as they are commanded, Cassian said, mounting the steps of the dais with slow, deliberate majesty. He stopped before Aurelia, towering over her. And as for you, Aurelia, you wanted a magnificent burial in Hollowcrest. It would be a pity to let the sarcophagus go to waste. The trial of the conspirators did not drag through weeks of corrupt legal debate. Cassian held it that very afternoon in the open court of the sun, before 10,000 citizens who had flooded through the palace gates to see their living emperor. Cedric Northcott was dragged into the light first. His right arm was wrapped in blood-soaked rags, the black rot having climbed past his elbow to his shoulder. He could barely walk, his knees sagging as two guards held him upright before the imperial seat. When he saw me sitting on a cushioned stool at Cassian's right hand, dressed in clean wool and silver, he began to blubber like a child. Ilara. Ilara, my daughter, my sweet child, tell them. Tell His Majesty how I protected you. I took you into Northcott Hall when your mother died. I gave you bread. I gave you shelter. The crowd murmured, their faces hard with contempt. Word of the 3,000 crowns and the iron shackle had already spread to every tavern and market stall in the city. You gave me the woodshed, Cedric, I said, my voice carrying over the silent thousands. You gave me the scraps the dogs refused. And when I spoke the truth about your debts and your cruelty, you called me a calamity so you wouldn't have to look at your own face in the mirror. Ilera, please. He sobbed, reaching out with his left hand, the hand that had slapped me across the face only 24 hours before. Lift the curse. My arm is rotting off. The pain. I cannot bear the pain. I did not place a curse on your arm, Cedric, I replied, looking down at him. Without a shred of hatred left in my heart, only the vast, empty cold of the Veyran peaks. The rot was already in your marrow. My words only stripped away the skin so the world could see what you are. Cashin raised his hand. Cedric Northcott. By decree of the crown, your titles are stripped, your lands confiscated to pay the debts owed to the merchants you swindled, and your name erased from the peerage of the realm. You shall spend what remains of your days in the salt mines of the southern coast. If your arm survives the journey, you may use it to swing a pickaxe. Cedric collapsed, screaming as the guards dragged him away, his boots leaving long streaks in the gravel. Next came Moira and Beatrice. Moira could no longer speak at all. Her throat had closed into a swollen, blackened column of flesh, her eyes bulging with terror as she knelt in the dirt. Beatrice, stripped of her stolen pearls and fine silk, huddled against her mother's skirt, her face streaked with tears and dirt, shivering violently under the cold northern wind. When Beatrice looked up at me, there was no pride left in her eyes, only a desperate, crawling terror. Ilera, Beatrice wept, pressing her forehead against the stones. Sister. Please. You always wanted my winter coat. Take all my dresses. Take my jewels. Take everything I own. Just tell His Majesty to spare my life. I was only doing what Mother told me. You stood on the steps of Northcott Hall, I said quietly, and you told me that calamities belong underground, rotting forever. You ground the seal of my mother's urn beneath your shoe. Beatrice shrank back, her teeth chattering so hard they clicked. You wanted to enter the palace, Beatrice, I continued. You wanted to walk through these gates in front of the whole court. Look around you. The whole court is here. Cashin leaned forward, resting his forearm on the carved armrest of the throne. Lady Beatrice. Lady Moira. For the murder of Lady Adeline Northcott by Cinnabar. Poison, and for complicity in high treason against the crown, your lives are forfeit. Beatrice shrieked, clutching Moira's neck. However, Cashin added, glancing at me, at the request of Lady Ilera, the sentence of the sword is commuted. Beatrice's eyes flared with a desperate, pathetic hope. Mercy? You give us mercy? You shall be taken to the cloister of the Silent Sisters in the northern wastes, Cashin said, his voice dropping like an iron portcullis. You shall take vows of eternal silence. If either of you speaks a single word above a whisper, your tongue shall be removed with hot tongs. You shall spend the rest of your lives washing the shrouds of the paupers you so despised. Moira let out a choked, dry wail. Beatrice slumped forward into the dust, fainting dead away. As the guards dragged them toward the black prison wagons, Tobias Vance stepped forward and signaled the drums. A low, solemn roll echoed across the square. Aurelia was brought out last. She did not kneel. Even in her chains, the Dowager Queen held her head high, her cold eyes sweeping over the commoners who hissed and spat at her feet. You have won this day, Cashin, Aurelia said as she reached the foot of the throne. You have your throne, and you have your Highland witch. But you will never have peace. The realm is fractured. The treasury is empty. The treasury is empty, Cashin said calmly, because you hid 4 million crowns of gold in the vaults beneath Hollowcrest Mausoleum to pay for your puppet prince's mercenaries. Aurelia's face stiffened. Tobias's men secured the vault 2 hours ago, Cashin continued. The gold will be used to rebuild the northern granaries and pave the Highland trade roads. He stood up, descending the steps until he stood directly in front of his grandaunt. You ordered a noblewoman buried with me to ensure I had company in the dark. Cashin murmured. I would not dream of depriving you of the same honor. Hollowcrest is fully sealed, Aurelia. Except for one chamber. Aurelia's breath hitched. For the first time, true terror broke through her aristocratic veneer. Cashin, you would not. I am your father's sister. I am of royal blood. And you tried to suffocate your emperor in his own tomb, Cashin said. Take her away. Her screams echoed long after the heavy iron doors of the prison carriage slammed shut. That night, the imperial palace was quiet for the first time in 10 years. The great braziers in the private solar were filled with aromatic pine wood from the southern forests, casting a warm, golden glow across the sheepskin rugs and heavy tapestries. I sat on the wide stone window seat, looking out over the city of Stone Harbor. Below, thousands of lantern lights twinkled in the dark streets, and from the squares came the faint, distant sound of people singing, rejoicing that the terror of the Dowager Queen's reign had ended without a war. Beside me, on a low table of carved walnut, sat the cedar box. Inside, resting on a bed of dry mountain lavender that Tobias had procured from a Highland merchant, was my mother's urn. The door opened with a soft latch click. Cashin entered, having stripped off his heavy armor and velvet robes. He wore a simple loose shirt of white linen and dark trousers, his dark hair still damp from washing away the last traces of the tomb's lime dust. He carried a silver tray with 2 bowls of hot Highland broth, barley, wild garlic, and dried mutton. You haven't eaten since yesterday morning, Cashin said, setting the tray down between us. I wasn't hungry, I replied. At Northcott Hall, when you were locked in the shed, your stomach learned to sleep. Cashin sat opposite me on the window bench, his long legs stretching out across the rug. He handed me a wooden spoon carved from birch. You don't have to sleep through your hunger anymore, Alara, he said gently. There is not a pantry in this realm that will ever be locked against you. I took the bowl. The steam rose into my face, smelling of the wild herbs my mother used to gather along the riverbanks when I was very small, before Cedric forbade her from ever leaving the courtyard. I ate in silence for several minutes. The food was hot and rich, settling the cold ache that had lived behind my ribs for as long as I could remember. Why did you believe me? I asked, looking up at him over the rim of the bowl. In the tomb. When I kicked open the coffin lid and told the steward that His Majesty was still breathing. Cashin looked at me, his slate-gray eyes softening in the firelight. Because I heard you at the solstice banquet, he said. I paused, spoon midway to my mouth. What? 2 weeks ago, Cashin murmured, leaning back against the stone wall. The Dowager Queen had surrounded me with 40 sycophants, all of them smiling, all of them swearing that the realm was at peace while they secretly negotiated with the border dukes to betray me. I was choking on their lies. I stepped out onto the east terrace to catch the winter wind. He smiled faintly, reaching out with one finger to tap the rim of my cedar box. I saw a girl standing near the kitchen gate, shivering in a torn servant's coat, clutching a bundle of dry roots. She looked up at me, saw my light tunic in the freezing wind, and muttered under her breath, dressed that lightly, His Majesty may stop breathing from the cold tonight. Cashin's voice dropped low, rich with a strange, deep warmth. Everyone else in that palace told me I would live 10,000 years. You were the only person in the entire city who told me I was about to die. It was a curse, I whispered, looking down at my scarred palms. That is what Cedric always said. That my tongue was poisoned. It was not a curse, Alara, Cashin said firmly. He reached across the space between us, his warm, calloused fingers closing gently around my hands, covering the faded red cuts from the coffin nails. I sent scholars to the Imperial archives last night while you were sleeping. The Veyran people have an ancient lineage, the Veiltari. The truth singers. I looked up at him, startled. The legends say that when a truth singer speaks, Cashin continued, the world does not bend to their malice. Rather, their voice strips away the illusion of time. They do not cause the frost, Alara, they simply see the ice breaking before the foot lands on it. They do not make the stallion kick, they hear the beast's terror before it lashes out. His thumb stroked the back of my hand, soothing the lingering ache in my skin. Your family called you a calamity because they were living in a fortress of lies. A thief cannot bear to be in the same room as someone who names the stolen goods. They hated you because your mouth made their rot visible. Tears, hot and sudden, pricked behind my eyelids. For 13 years, I had believed that I had broken my sister's fingers. I had believed that I had cracked Moira's ribs. I had lived in terror of my own voice, biting my tongue until it bled, swallowing every word of grief and anger because I was afraid I would bring down the sky upon anyone I looked at. I didn't kill grandmother Adeline, I whispered, the tears finally spilling over my lashes, hot against my cheeks. No, Cashin said softly, shifting closer until his shoulder pressed against mine, his arm wrapping around my back to draw me against his chest. You tried to save her. And when you couldn't, you saved me instead. I buried my face in his linen shirt, clutching the fabric in both fists. I did not weep like Beatrice wept, loud, theatrical, and pleading. I wept the deep, quiet, ragged tears of someone who had spent her entire life holding her breath underwater, finally breaking the surface to find the sky wide, clean, and full of stars. Cashin held me through the long hours of the night, his hands steady against my hair, until the fire burned down to glowing embers and the breathing between us became slow, quiet, and one. 2 months later, the spring thaw had arrived in the northern mountains. The heavy winter ice that choked the dragon's throat pass had shattered into crystalline turquoise flows, tumbling down the roaring mountain rivers toward the sea. The gray slopes of the Veyra Highlands were coming alive with wild mountain heather, pale purple and sharp-scented, bursting through the receding snowfields. A caravan of 50 riders wound its way up the ancient stone switchbacks. There were no imperial banners of gold and black, no marching phalanxes, and no screaming crowds. There were only 50 seasoned riders dressed in sturdy travel wool, led by Tobias Vance, who spent most of his time whistling Highland tunes he had learned from the local guides. At the head of the column rode Cashin and I, side by side on 2 sturdy mountain ponies. Cashin wore no crown. His hair was windswept, his face tanned by weeks of travel under the high mountain sun, his eyes brighter and clearer than they had ever been in the suffocating halls of Stone Harbor. The imperial duties had been left in the hands of a newly appointed council of guardians, honest magistrates, and veterans who governed under strict charters while their sovereign rode north. Across my lap, wrapped in a mantle of fine Highland wool dyed the pale blue of the mountain sky, lay my mother's cedar box. Is it far? Cashin asked, looking up at the towering granite peaks that pierced the clouds like the teeth of sleeping giants. Just past the ridge, I said, pointing toward a high, grassy plateau where a single ancient stone cairn stood beneath the branches of 3 mountain pines. The clan of the Silver River buried their daughters there for 800 years before the Southern Wars. We dismounted at the base of the ridge and walked the remaining half-mile on foot, our boots crunching through the lingering crusts of spring snow. When we reached the cairn, the wind met us, not the bitter, choking wind of Stone Harbor's alleys, but the sweet, clean, freezing wind that smelled of melting ice, stone, and wild heather. I knelt before the gray stones of the cairn. Cashin knelt beside me, taking his hunting knife and carefully clearing away the dry moss and winter debris from the central hollow. Together, we opened the cedar box. I lifted the porcelain urn, broke the fresh wax seal with my own fingers, and looked inside at the clean, pale gray ashes of the woman who had sung me to sleep while the rain beat down on the laundry shed of Northcott Hall. Mother, I said softly, the words rising on the mountain breeze. I kept my promise. You are home. I tipped the urn into the clean stone hollow beneath the pines. The wind caught the pale dust, lifting it into the air in a shimmering, silver cloud. It drifted out over the vast, sunlit valley below, scattering across the heather slopes, over the roaring turquoise rivers, returning to the earth that had birthed it. A strange, light feeling settled into my chest, as if an iron chain that had bound my lungs for 20 years had simply dissolved into mist. I stood up, the empty urn resting lightly in my hands. Cashin stood beside me, taking the urn from my fingers and setting it gently beside the cairn, placing 3 wild purple heather blossoms inside the rim. Then he turned to face me. Your mother is home, Alara, he said softly. Yes, I replied, looking out over the endless peaks. She is. And what about you? Cashin asked. I looked at him. The Emperor of Stone Harbor, the man who had survived poison, tombs, and traitors, was looking at me with a question in his eyes that held no imperial command, only the quiet, patient hope of a man offering his whole life to the only person who had ever spoken the truth to him. The court in Stone Harbor will be waiting, I said, a faint smile touching my lips. The ministers will need someone to tell them when their ledgers are rotten. The prelates will need someone to tell them when their prayers are empty. And the emperor? Cashin murmured, stepping closer, his hands coming up to cup my face, his thumbs brushing across my cheekbones where the scars of Northcott Hall had completely faded into smooth, healthy skin. What will the emperor need? The emperor, I whispered, reaching up to lay my hands over his, feeling the strong, steady beat of his life beneath my fingers, will need someone to remind him to wear a heavier coat in the winter wind. Cashin laughed, a rich, bright sound that echoed off the granite cliffs and soared into the high blue sky. He leaned down and kissed me, there beneath the 3 mountain pines, between the earth and the heavens, where no lie could ever reach us again. In the 4th year of the reign of Emperor Cashin and Empress Alara, the imperial chronicler wrote the final lines of the Annals of the Restoration. In the days before the Great Reckoning, men said that words were cheap, and that truth was a coin spent only by fools. But in the reign of the High Queen, from the Veyra Highlands, the realm learned a different law. It was decreed that no judge may accept a confession sealed in fear, that no father may sell the blood of his house for royal favor, and that the name of a baseborn child shall carry the same weight before the throne as the name of a duke. The people of the northern mountains say that when the empress sits upon the high seat of Stone Harbor, she wears no crown of beaten gold, only 9 silver pins of mountain birch in her dark hair. And they say that in her presence, no man has ever been able to tell a lie and keep his voice, for the queen does not wield an executioner's axe. She only speaks the truth, and the world, in its terror and its beauty, obeys.